Well, hey, this is Richard Chansey with 24 to Double, and I've got a great interview lined up for you today with a pastor named Joe Dobbins from Twin Rivers Worship Center up in St. Louis. Now, Joe was a 24 to Double participant years ago, but he also partnered with us to coach churches through it for several years. And in that process, he wound up doing some consulting with a church, and now he's the lead pastor of that church. So this is a great interview, and he dives into details about how they're using specific elements of 24 to Double in their church, like the pastor's breakfast, and how they're using that environment to transition people from the street or from seats into circles, small groups, and volunteer ministry. So make sure that you hang out and listen to the whole interview. It's only about 30 minutes long, and I know you're going to get a ton of value out of this. So thanks and enjoy the interview. Well, hey, this is Richard with 24 to Double, and I am really excited today to have as my guest on the podcast Joe Dobbins from Twin Rivers Worship Center up in St. Louis. Joe, how you doing?
It's so great to be with you, Richard. Thank you again for allowing me to be a part.
Yeah, and man, I really enjoy taking the time out of our schedule to kind of dive in, not just with pastors that are in 24 to Double, but just with pastors in general, because I think everybody has a story to tell, and there's bits and pieces of that story that are going to resonate with the people that are watching this on YouTube or listening to it on the podcast. So I just wanted to say thanks for that. And with that, hey, let's dive right in. Give me your background. I know Jerry Lawson, who is my partner in 24 to Double, introduced us, but tell me, how do you know Jerry, and kind of how'd you get involved in this world?
Well, a real quick kind of just rundown of that is, I was on staff at a church. I was low man on the totem pole, and we started attending. The church I was at was in decline, and we started attending 24 to Double sessions at Jerry's church. And when the rest of the staff kind of was scratching their heads and still trying to figure it out, it's like something clicked for me, and all of a sudden, I really grasped the principles of 24 to Double. And so I kind of became a junkie, headed it up for our church, and it saw some great results. In that, Jerry, I guess, saw something in me, gave me an opportunity to help start consulting churches. I did that, and that led me to the church we're at now at Twin Rivers. They hired me as their executive pastor based on a consulting kind of connection. And then a year ago, a little over 18 months ago, the senior pastor, who had been here 27 years, had taken the church from 52 people to over 2,000 people left. And, by God's grace and ordination, I became the lead pastor here.
Yeah, so one of the big lessons I just learned from you there is be careful if you're consulting with churches,
Yeah.
because you
Yeah.
could wind up being the lead pastor of that church. So you said something clicked. Can you take us back and kind of, do you remember what it was specifically, like the idea or the thought that clicked?
For me, what 24 to Double did for me is it demystified church growth. And I feel like so many people struggle with this idea that it's just this real ambiguous kind of thing that takes place. And for me, who I'm a bit analytical, it was great to know if I wanted to grow by 25%, I just needed to put in, more leaders to that queue. That 1-to-4 ratio is so incredible. But even to the fact of, seeing the grid laid out between giftings and teams and how to organize that. And it just really demystified the whole idea of what you need to do, how to do it. And it made it more of a formula, which for me, and I think for a lot of pastors, just it is really helpful to know, okay, if we want to grow, let's just take and add 25 more people, and that's going to end up with 100 people ultimately in our worship services. I think that just is simple and comforting.
Yeah, and it's an incredibly powerful concept. Jerry teaches us a lot, and I'll just hit it real quick because some of the people listening may not know what the 1-to-4 ratio is. But basically, for every person you add in a volunteer spot in your church will grow by 4. And that may sound like hocus pocus or mysticism to some of you, but if you think about the 80-20 principle, that 20% of the people do 80% of the work. Well, for every person you add to the 20%, your church is going to naturally expand. So it's not just Jerry's principle or 24 to Double. It's actually the Pareto principle that the more people that you add in volunteer roles, the more your church will grow. It's an inverse relationship. We don't necessarily think of growing our churches from the inside out that way, but it absolutely works.
It was really just a powerful concept that we apply here and have applied everywhere, that just continues to be proven and proven. And so for me, it just clicked in that way. And then also, the thing about 24 to doubles is so common sense. Just the idea of how we host people when they come to you think about how you host someone when they come to your house, and the way you treat them, and then just taking that very principle and applying it to your church. For me, it just is so practical that it's just been that. I think that's why it's so successful.
Yeah. Now talk a little bit about that, about hosting people, because this is what's fascinating to me is how many pastors have been through 24 to double and they'll tell me something that we taught them that we didn't actually teach them. Which we do teach that kind of concept, but when it begins to grow in your church and you make it your own, it looks completely different. So what does it mean to host people at Twin Rivers?
For us, we really do start with the concept of if you were coming to our house for dinner, how would we treat you? What's the attitude with which we would treat that? So we wouldn't, first of all, we would meet you, at the door. We would have given you great directions to get there, but we would have met you at the door. We wouldn't just holler from the living room, hey, come on in, find your way in. We help you to come in, and we'd immediately show you where the important things are. So this is where the restroom is. This is where the kitchen's going to be. If you need anything, all with this attitude of we're just excited you're here. And so, that for us is very important, because we really feel like the first question anyone asks when they come to a local church is not, do I like the preacher? Do I like the music? Or do I even believe what they believe? I think the first question people ask is, can I meet a friend here? It's a relational question first. And so for us, here's the problem I think a lot of churches have, is that their follow-up system addresses a question that's not being asked yet. So it's like, here's what we believe, here's how you can get plugged in, here's these things. But that's not the first question people are asking. The first question people are asking is, can I meet someone? So that's why, for instance, pastor's breakfast is such a vital part, because it answers the top question of, can I meet a friend here in a relational way? And so for us, that's how we look at hosting people, is that we want them to feel like that, just like the same attitude, if you came to our house, we're engaged into you, your needs, helping you have an enjoyable experience.
That's incredible. And it dives into a principle that I absolutely believe is true. And it's the idea that people gravitate towards environments where they're accepted and away from environments where they feel rejected. And I often try to tell pastors, just remember the last time you went to somewhere for the first time that you didn't know anybody, and how awkward that was and what that felt like. And you've got to mitigate that.
I, I was just going to say, I always tell this story, is that when my wife and I first got married, we went to her family's for our first holiday, and it was Thanksgiving. And I remember going to that event, and all her family's there. And then it's kind of like they always knew when dinner was served. They knew kind of who the patriarchs were and where they sat, and they kind of knew that these people were served first, and the kids sit in this room, and they just kind of knew. And it's not that they were bad people; they were a tight-knit family. It's just I wasn't a part of that family yet, and it made my experience completely different. And I remember just sitting back and kind of freezing, because not knowing what the tradition was and what it is, because no one intentionally helped me become a part of that family that day.
Right. And dive a little bit. You mentioned the pastor's breakfast earlier, and for those that don't know, talk about what you do with the pastor's breakfast, and how you're leveraging that environment.
Well, we believe that the absolutely people want to meet the pastor and connect with him, especially at a church our size, or Daystar as an example. People they want to meet and just have an up close, kick the tires experience with the pastor. And so we use that as a carrot and a stick, if you will, to invite people to a pastor's breakfast, which, let me say, we make extremely convenient. I really feel like we have to ask ourselves the question in follow up: are we making this as easy as possible for someone? So the location of the room is central to the lobby. The instructions we provide are extremely clear, and we provide them multiple times and multiple messages. And we just want people to really make it, we want to make it as easy as possible for them to take that step. But every Sunday, people show up, and what's great is that it's an intimate setting. No matter the church size, it is an intimate setting that you can create. So we serve breakfast, and really the most important position for us in our pastor's breakfast is what we call a table host. And that's not, you would think the pastor's the most important part, but he's really not. I'm only in there for probably 8 minutes max. It's just kind of a meet and greet, and really just sharing the attitude or culture of the church through just a greeting. The most important person for us at a pastor's breakfast is the table host. That's a planted individual who's been trained to ask questions, connect people to their next step, and really show compassion and full engagement into the individual. And so, because once again, we're trying to have someone leave that experience and say, I can make a friend here.
Yeah, that's huge. And give examples of, so when they come into that environment, next steps. There's always something for them to do next, something to move forward into ministry, into deeper relationships. Talk about what are some of their options, and which ones do most people tend to gravitate towards?
Well, for us, it's Pastor's Breakfast is a beginner for what we call Connect Track. Some people may call Growth Track, but it's basically a 4-session system that it basically covers the first session covers who we are as a church, kind of the questions of just who's in charge, is there accountability, what are the central beliefs, how are we governed? I think more than any other time in church history, people are asking about stewardship. And so this is a place that we answer the question of, we're good stewards of your time, your energy, and what God's given us. The second session for us is what we call essentials. And it's about just becoming a better believer. So it's prayer, giving, fasting, just Bible, daily, disciplines we want them to develop. Then the third one is for us focuses on life groups or small groups. And here's the first time we want you to move out of that rotation. We have an 87% retention rate from our Connect Track third session to a life group. And a life group for us is a weekly small group that meets in various places around various interests in the church. But that's a major deal for us because, again, it's the relational question still being asked in the first month they're there. And so if we can connect them there, we feel like it's a major, major win. And then the final one is one we call Discovering Your Purpose, where we're going to unpack a spiritual gifts test, and we're going to unpack, them connecting to a team. But by far, the big win is people making it to a life group out of Connect Track.
Yeah. And do you keep numbers on what percentage of those people are around 1 year, 3 years, 5 years?
Yeah, 87% take that step and make it into a life group. And so for us, our church has really been revolutionized by life groups. We have, on a weekly attendance, we're going to be somewhere 1,700 people. And right now we have in this semester like 1,470 some odd people in a life group. And so for us, that is a culture we've created. And we feel like to create that culture, you have to do it as soon as people come through the door.
So you've got 90% of the people that you've got, well, it's not necessarily 90%. If you've got 1,600 in average weekly attendance, you got 1,400 people in life groups.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And for us, that's a lot of work. It's a lot of emphasis. And just, as forthright, those are not duplicate numbers, but, there's probably to the tune of 200 people that don't even attend our church that are part of those groups too, though.
Right. And, and more average weekly attendance is not the best number for active involvement because the average person's only coming 2.4 times.
Yeah, and for us, our database tells us that in a month we will see around 2,200 different people come through the door.
Yeah, and I'm at North Point here in Atlanta, and Andy Stanley always says that life change happens in circles, not in rows, and what he means is in groups. And you guys are killing it for getting people into groups, and that really is what people want from church. They want community.
Yeah, for us, it's become a huge priority, but it's not a hard sell because even, an unbeliever, their life centers around relationships. And one of the things, we say is that, which is not coined by us, but, that discipleship happens in the context of a relationship. We'll ask people, name 10 sermons that you can remember, and nobody can come up with it, but then we'll say, name 10 people that have influenced your life. So it's not a hard sell. It's just, it takes a lot of intentionality. And, here's the truth. We're trying, as coined by Pastor Jerry, we're trying to be a larger church that feels still small, that we're growing larger and smaller at the same time. And so we put a ton of emphasis. I would say our uniqueness is we train our leaders to have individual conversations that help people move to programming. And what I mean by that is, we can make an announcement, we can put it in the bulletin, but people hide in crowds. But we train our staff, our leaders, that every conversation is this. In the back of your mind, when you're talking to someone in the lobby after a prayer moment, we're saying, where is this person and where do they need to be? And what that means is that out of every conversation, I know this person needs to go to Connect Track. This person needs to go to a life group. This person needs to start serving. This person needs to go to our counseling center. And so we just look at, if you will, we look at our major programming groups, Connect Track, worship services as stations on an assembly line, but we look at our leaders as a conveyor belt that move people through those stations.
Yeah. Hey, so I'm going to switch gears a little bit on you. Talk just a little bit about. I'm trying to think if I want to go forward or backwards here. So let's go forward for a second. When you look out over the next year to 3 years to 5 years, what do you see as the biggest challenge that's coming for Twin Rivers and for you as a leader in this church?
Well, there's no doubt that, we're not in a what I would call growing season right now because we were paralyzed by transition. When a legacy leader leaves a church, everybody pauses to say, what is, do I want to be here? Do I want to be a part? Do I like the new guy? So forth and so on. And so we're just coming out of that. So now it's back for us. Let me say that paralysis happens in the mind of the staff as well. And so they don't perform as well. And so some of our things that we do, that we used to do really well 2 years ago, we need to learn to do well again. And so we've got to create, like next year, our banner for internally is going to be better, hashtag better. We just want to get better at everything. But I really feel by 2017, we're going to be strongly moving forward. Now, our biggest challenge is a location challenge. St. Louis is 250 years old. It's not like the South. There's not property everywhere, and the property that is available is extremely expensive. And so for us, multi-siting is something that is a reality. We have a site currently, a second site, but it was our laboratory. We did everything wrong. We're starting to see now the fruit of it, but we did everything wrong. But we want to launch another site to help reach our city because with the location challenges you have, that's really our only option here in the Midwest.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be a bigger issue for churches as more and more people move to metropolitan areas. That we're all struggling with that. Which I'm on the north side of Atlanta, and it's hard for churches to get going here because they start in a school, they build some momentum, and then they have a hard time transitioning to property because the giving's just not where it needs to be.
Yeah, I mean, we'll probably be at a third service in the next probably 6 months. And with that being the case, I mean, that comes with a set of challenges. So we're trying to learn from the best multi-site. I mean, we spend time at Life Church. We've spent time, looking at Church of the Highlands significantly. I mean, we're spending time trying to learn because in 3 to 4 years, we've got to do something bigger than what we're doing.
Yeah. So let me dive into that just a little bit because I know that there's a lot of pastors that are listening to this that they're in a church where the last guy had a lot of influence. And for one reason or another, most of the time that guy he's retired or whatever it is. And they've done it this way for 20 years and that's the way they do it. And the new guy has a hard time gaining influence. I mean, how do you approach that issue of not being the go-to guy as you're taking on, transition and moving into that role over time?
For me, I made a commitment to be hungry and humble. And I felt like that was the right thing for me to do as a leader because I haven't accomplished more than the pastor that was here before. I mean, he was a dear mentor in my life, and he left. But what I found is that when people saw that, one, I was humble, that just the idea, and that goes back to a spiritual principle. God gives grace to the humble, which that means that God opposes the proud, and so God's supernatural ability comes through humility. So I just continued to show people that I just felt it was the greatest honor in the world to serve them. And in a large church, that can get lost because the pastor of a large church can come across as the smartest guy in the room. It's hard to be humble when you lead 2,000 people because people want to elevate you. They want to do that. And so I just remained to stay humble, continually just showing them how much I want to serve them. And I think that opened their hearts. And then they saw that I was hungry. There's no doubt that a pastor who's been somewhere for 20 plus years, that they're probably, struggle to continually revive themselves to be hungry again and again and again. Well, I didn't have that problem. I mean, I'm a first pastorate out of the gate. I'm hungry. I want to do something. And people were they were drawn to that because, that it felt fresh.
Yeah. Yeah. That is, I think that is one of the most difficult things to do as a leader is to constantly remind yourself, especially in the world that we live in, that God's working through you, and it's not necessarily you doing the work. And over the years, I've had the opportunity to be around a lot of church famous people, having worked with, you may not know this, but the people listening probably will, that I worked with John Maxwell for years. And I think I've met just about every celebrity pastor that there is. And it is just amazing how hard it is not to buy into the hype, or when people are coming up and saying, great sermon, you're doing this great, or you have a little bit of success, like figuring out how to fight that off so that you can stay humble and still continue to grow.
Yeah, it's been huge. And then, if because every good pastor alliterates, if we were going to add another H, it would be honoring. We have never once said anything negative. Even if we felt that way, we've never once said anything that was disparaging to the former. We tried our best to make it look like what it was, which was one generation handing to the next generation. And we knew there were bumps, but you have to honor up in order to be given authority down.
Yeah. And I think it says a lot about the previous pastor's leadership, that the fact that the church did not just fall apart after he left, because I think there's a lot of churches there are a lot of churches that have a tough time making that transition because it's so focused around that personality.
And let me say, he, over 27 years, the church had to change a lot. And before he left, he spent every ounce of his legacy equity to make those changes happen, so I didn't have to. And now we've had to make some changes, but it was a partnership. And it's the only way that I think churches get another generation under them. Because most churches have a life span and they die. And I feel like we've been given a new life, but it was because both generations were very intentional.
Yeah, for sure. Hey, go back now and let's talk about you. So you got involved with Jerry. Now, were you on staff at a different church when you were going through that?
Yeah, I was. It was a church that was declining. A church that I remember my first day was at 900. The 2 years later, we were running 500. Rapid decline, and so 24toDouble was something that actually stopped the decline and helped us gain some momentum. I left before that situation was fully rectified. But I was on staff at another church, but just felt a brotherhood with Jerry, Lance, and ended up, like I said, consulting in over 4 years, over 150 different pastors using 24toDouble and different things like that.
And if you had to, man, this is going to be a big question to sum up in just a paragraph or two. But like, if you take a step back from those 150 pastors that you worked with, what would you say the biggest challenge that they faced in turning the ship? Because there's a lot of guys out there that it's just as hard to get a flat church to gain momentum as it is the one that's declining, maybe even harder because of some of the elements, but because sometimes people think good is good enough. When you're in severe decline like that, everybody knows that something needs to happen. But, when you're replacing the dead every year and that's how you're staying flat, I mean, people think, well, this is our church and it's for us and not for anybody else. I mean, how do you, when you look out there at those churches, what do you see as the biggest stumbling block in getting going?
This is going to sound probably a little, I don't want it to sound as harsh as it may sound, but the difference between the churches that I worked with that were successful and the ones that were not successful, when it really came down to it, was work ethic. For what I found was that there are a lot of pastors who had been banged up personally, and that had caused them, to kind of lose a little fire in the belly. And so that may have been the thing that kept them. And then there's some guys, I mean, just like in any career field, there's some people that just aren't super ambitious, or that, just plain out, aren't really hardworking. I didn't meet a ton of them, but oftentimes the majority of guys couldn't end up applying themselves to the principles enough because they just couldn't get themselves out of the weeds. And, with the everyday issues, the people personality thing, all that kind of stuff. But when you really sum it up, it's not, 24toDouble is phenomenal, but it's not a magic bullet. You have to work it really hard. And so the guys, there was one church I worked with that was 72 people the day I walked in. 4 years later, they were 700 people in a town of 2,500. And, the fact is that guy outworked everybody, and so a lot of times, we're, as your pastor says, we're all educated beyond our obedience.
Yes. Yeah. And I think, most of the pastors I talk to, it's not that the work ethic isn't it the issue. Figuring out the right things to do is the issue, and the things that you and I are talking about today, very rarely is somebody coming and they're knocking on the pastor's door and saying, you better figure this out, figure out how to get new people in here. It's usually everything but that. And saying yes to something like this and the work that comes along with it means you got to say no to a lot of other stuff. And there's a lot more political ramifications to those things.
That's absolutely true. And, that's the power of a once a month, what I would call consultant, but it doesn't really even have to be a consultant. For instance, say there are two pastors who are going through 24toDouble as a video venue. Just meet with one another and hold each other accountable, serve as a consultant to one another, because I feel like when someone's coming to your site every 30 days, it does keep you focused on, okay, I need to get these 3 greeter meetings set up. I need to get, this outreach team, Christmas is we got to get these mailers done. I just think there's a lot of power in that accountability.
Yeah. And the best part about it is you're not driving all that as the lead guy.
Yep.
Yeah. Hey, have you heard of a book called The One Thing?
I have heard of it. I've not read it.
So, well, and the authors would probably kill me for telling you this, but the one question is, what's the one thing having been done makes everything else either easier or unnecessary?
Yeah.
So, which is a great question, when you kind of take a step back from your whole ministry and think, what's the most important thing for me to do next? And if I do that thing, it's going to eliminate a lot of the other work that I have to do. When I ask you that question, what's the first thing that comes to mind?
That's easy. And that's a principle I've lived by. I said it last night in our elders meeting. Ephesians 4 says that I am called to equip the saints for the service of ministry. And that means if I do ministry, I'm not doing what God's called me to. I think at the end of this, I'm going to stand before God and he's going to say, how many people did you equip? How many people discovered their purpose under you? Were put into ministry under you? I don't think he's going to say how many people listened to you, how many people raised their hands. I think I'm called as an equipper. And if you're a pastor, you're an equipper. And so that's what everything has to be filtered through.
Yeah, I heard a pastor at Catalyst years ago say that when you're doing something when you do things other than what God's called you to do, there's a word for that. Sin.
Yeah, absolutely.
And not that I'm saying that doing ministry is sin, but if you're called to equip the saints and you're actually doing ministry, then, hey, and if you got a beef with me about that, it's joedobbins@gmail.com. Just hit me up on that. Hey, let me finish with a kind of a complex question, but I think it needs to be asked. So you were an executive pastor, now you're a lead pastor. What are 3 things that every pastor needs to know about his staff, the people that work underneath him?
Yeah, right. Number one, I would say a pastor needs to remember that the staff needs a pastor too. And, that is one of the things that we forget because we work with people. So we kind of have these 2 hats sometimes where in the office, it's all about getting stuff done. And on Sundays, we're, this caring, loving guy. Well, the staff needs to see the guy from Sunday too. And so that is very, very important. Otherwise, I think people only follow you for 2 reasons. They either believe in the vision or they believe in you. And I think that a pastor that'll pastor his staff gets both of those, The second thing I think is that, I want to make sure to really pull it in. I think clear expectations are absolutely essential. If you went to most pastors and said, what is the win for this staff member? And then you went to that staff member and said, what are you being graded by? What's your win? Most of the time, they're going to come up with 2 different answers. And so fiercely fighting that they know what their win is and it's whatever you hold them to, I think is extremely important. So that clear expectations is so important. And then finally, I would just say to create a culture that just really makes it, that it's positive. And I know that sounds odd or maybe fun would be the word. If we're not careful as pastors, we can see everything that's wrong. And then we create a culture that nothing's ever right. And nobody wants to work in that culture. And so if pastors have to be the chief encouragement or chief celebration officer, to their staff, that's just 3 that come to mind.
Man, that's huge. That's a whole nother podcast. Just those 3 things.
I just want to say, just the defense of pastors, as coming from an executive pastor to be the pastor, let me say this. It doesn't matter what staff member thinks they know what a pastor deals with. There is a spiritual weight that comes with being the pastor that you cannot experience till you're the pastor. And so there may be a staff member listening. It's like, man, don't know why he doesn't make that decision. I don't know why he just doesn't do this. There's just, you don't have a view that gets to see everything the way that he gets to. And I didn't realize that, even though I was the second guy in the organization. And so I have a lot more grace for pastors now.
Yeah, I'll tell you two things about that. If you're the guy that's underneath the pastor, Jim Kuzis said this. I worked for Catalyst for years, so I got all these quotes. But Jim Kuzis said, sooner or later, sooner or later, everybody in your organization leaves. But that's not the quote. The quote was this, that everybody in your organization thinks they know how to do it better than you do, right? So if you're the person underneath the main person, realize that you feel that way and everybody around you feels that way. But the other side of that is when you're the lead dog, no, you have to understand that nobody underneath you understands what it means to be the lead dog. I learned this now having my own organization and having worked in another organization. As soon as I started my first business and my first ministry, I thought, I cannot believe I complained about these other people not knowing what they're doing, because you really know about 30% of what's going on if you're not the main person. So I absolutely 100% agree with that. Hey man, I really do appreciate this. And I hope we can, maybe we can have you back and we can do this in the future and dive a little deeper on some stuff. But this has been a great interview, and I know that the pastors listening have been served well. So thanks, Joe.
Well, thank you for having me again. And we just, cheering everybody on, really excited about everything that's happening in the kingdom for every one of those guys that are listening today.
Thanks. Hey, thanks so much for being with us on the call today. And I hope you got a ton of value out of this. Like I said, Joe is a phenomenal guy and really has a grasp of the fundamentals of what we're trying to do with 24toDouble. If you're interested in 24toDouble, you can try it out now. You can actually try it out free for 14 days. If you just go to 24trial.com, and everything you need to know about the program is right there. And if you want to kick the tires, you're welcome to do that as well. In fact, we'll even give you an agenda and a video for an hour-long meeting with your team about 24toDouble. So go on over to 24trial.com right now and check it out. Otherwise, we'll see you on the next episode.